Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Warren, and I work in our brokerage marketing department here at UPS. And today I have the pleasure of moderating this session. Many of today's sessions have covered managing changes in the current supply chain environment. And when it comes to trade compliance, change is a constant. With new tariffs, trade tensions, and geopolitical shifts, on top of regular complexities of trade, managing risk becomes essential for securing your bottom line. Our speakers today are experts on trade compliance, and they're here to share how you can leverage trade compliance to mitigate risk. Our first speaker is Ron Shepard. Ron is the Director of Cross-Border Trade Compliance for UPS Supply Chain Solutions and has over 30 years of experience in managing cross-border trade operations and compliance programs with UPS. Ron is also a licensed customs broker. And our other speaker is Jessica Rosen. Jessica is the President of STTAS, a UPS company. Jessica is also an accredited zone specialist, a licensed customs broker, a certified customs specialist, and a certified export specialist. Jessica has over 10 years of experience focusing on international trade and compliance with over 20 years of experience with international logistics. So welcome both.
Hi, Natalie.
So Ron, before we can dive into how we can manage risk in the supply chain, I think it's important for us to first define what kind of risk we're talking about.
Sure. So cross-border companies that do importing and exporting typically see that risk mitigation comes in the primary form of ensuring that you or your organization stays out of jail or doesn't incur penalties or any types of damages as a result of doing bad business. And that's where the primary focus of most trade compliance programs are centered around. However, there are other areas of risk for organizations who do business internationally. And we're seeing a lot of those happen as we speak in the last few weeks, or actually in the last couple of years. But you have risks in terms of your supply chain velocity and how fast you can get your materials for manufacturing or to your customers, which ultimately results in your ability to get your return on your capital. You also have risk in terms of your customers and whether or not you can acquire customers and service them. And then you have risk in terms of your profitability. So there's also one more that we're seeing right now and playing out as we speak, and that is brand risk, and whether or not your brand is liable for risk or damage reputation based on your business practices. And that's something that's come to light most immediately in the last couple of weeks.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Ron. And Jessica, can you give a little more detail on how this risk can impact businesses?
Sure, Natalie, I'd be happy to. So when you consider risk within a multinational organization, in addition to the topics that Ron talked about, you can really categorize it in a few different ways, right? So growth and facilitation of growth. When you consider risk, you have to consider your growth trajectory. Where are you planning to grow? What are the regions that you're planning to grow in, and what types of impacts or specific trade regulations do you need to be aware of in order to facilitate that type of growth? You need to have the ability to be versatile within your footprint, and growth could go in one or two directions, right? You could want to grow within one area and shrink into another, which then leads into velocity. You need to be able to adjust between market demands. The ability to scale up and scale down and shift quickly is going to be critical, especially within this current trade landscape. Organizations are finding that the constant changes within regulations and the ebb and flow of trade within what's happening in the industry requires this type of fluctuation to meet those demands and to meet the demands of where you're actually going to be sourcing from. So not only customer demands. The rate of change could be exponentially greater in some areas and lessened in others. And also cost reduction, right? So businesses need to be cognizant of how changes within the trade community are impacting their costs, whether it's cost to source goods, cost of risk, cost of delayed goods. All of these different components build into this overall cost. And of course, the end goal is cost reduction. And of course, the cost of non-compliance, right? So what does it mean for an organization if they do have inherent risk and make a decision with a higher amount of risk and what is the cost of that non-compliance to their organization. So those are a few of the categories that I believe are important when you start talking about risk considerations for organizations today.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessica. And thank you both for providing some context to the risk and the extent of business that can be impacted through proper or lacking trade compliance. I'd like to dive right into an example of a geopolitical shift that can have a wide impact on shippers. As an example, the tensions in Eastern Europe between Russia and Ukraine and its impact on global trade. Ron, can you give us some context as to what is happening and what does it mean from the perspective of trade compliance?
Sure, Natalie. So I expect that many people on this call are very aware of what's happening in Eastern Europe between Russia and Ukraine. And over the last few weeks, we've seen a number of things unfold pertaining to sanctions, other types of executive orders, and then globally governments taking actions to constrain Russia, for the most part, in its ability to do any type of financing or trade with many parts of the industrial world. So what we're seeing is, or what we started out to see, was that these sanctions and orders that were in place were restricting financial types of opportunities to move money between the countries, and that being locked down. And then we saw sanctions against certain types of entities within Russia or in other locations, preventing businesses, at least American-owned businesses, from doing business with those entities, or companies who want to do business with American companies doing business with those entities as well. So that is something that also needs to be looked at from a global compliance trade scale. But then we also started to see where sanctions were applying against certain types of materials, preventing them from being exported into Russia as well. So when you look at all those things, you have to make sure that your trade compliance program can identify what parts of your supply chain as well as your customer base are at risk because of those things, and be able to mitigate them very quickly. The other thing that we've seen play out probably more recently, and this has happened in the past, but it's at least a very good demonstration of companies not wanting to do business with Russia as a brand risk type of mitigation scenario here that's playing out. So we saw, credit card companies, because of the cumbersome way of having to manage their trade compliance programs and who they do business with or whatever, they stopped facilitating transactions. And then there was a ripple effect across many industries where people are just saying there's too much risk. We're not wanting to facilitate this type of business, even though there may have been some laws or regulations or loopholes, so to speak, that allowed for some type of trade. They're deciding to do a complete seizure or ban on operations or trade with Russia. The other thing we have to consider or think about is that there's still, there's still people in Russia and some parts of these worlds where people are still reliant upon goods and materials and services, and so that is weighing on the trade and industry across the globe when they make those decisions. And so, whether or not these types of legal bans or bans that the companies are making themselves continue or not will, I think, play out as we see, this development continue.
Awesome. Thanks, Ron. And Jessica, can you give some more information on how this is going to impact customers and what can customers do to mitigate this kind of risk and similar situations in the future?
Yeah. So when you think about the impact to customers, I want to just add on to a piece that Ron talked about as far as the type of goods and the industry impact. So within organizations, when you have significant changes in, again, what we were talking about earlier, which is the availability of goods or the cost of goods, really it also ties into what may be impacted down the road. Although you may not have a specific commodity directly listed, it could be a downstream domino effect for the original origin good that could impact you. This ties into contingencies. We do find that customers who work to mitigate risk, one of the best practices is having a GTMS or global trade management system. Knowledge is power, information is power, and if you have to make immediate changes, or you want to even consider making a change, understanding what that means to your overall operation is crucially important. GTMS can allow you the opportunity to really evaluate the downstream impact of those decisions and also help you to map out contingencies. You know, it's so important to stay close to the trade community at times like this as well. You have to consider, are you actively engaged in associations? Do you have a trade consultant that you can lean into, or other industry experts? A lot of organizations have compliance in-house, but really the power is when you can collaborate across those that are in the same type of situation across the organization, or excuse me, across the international landscape to support your organization. So I would say engagement with associations is also key for having a strong trade compliance program. And then, you know, just understanding to that point of staying in touch with compliance matters. Again, it's the ebb and flow and the shift, which could happen quicker than originally anticipated. So backups and contingencies, backups for the backups are also going to be very important when you start considering impacts and what you can do to mitigate the risk down the road.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jessica. So I know we've just scratched the surface on how geopolitics and trade regulations can really impact your supply chain in your entire business. And I'm sure there are countless of examples that we could talk through, but Jessica, I was hoping to steer the conversation towards how companies shipping across borders can be prepared for situations like this. What advice would you give to customers for building resiliency against uncertainty?
So the theme I'm going to keep talking about is information and knowledge, right? So having the information at hand, and information allows informed decisions and allows for adaptability. So, you know, when you start considering information and how that can be useful and impactful going forward in planning, you know, it's creating resiliency, not only to have that information, but to know what to do with it and to have those mitigation strategies. Considering your footprint, considering the ability to be versatile and source from other locations. And also something to consider is the amount of engagement that you have across your supply chain. If you have a supply chain that has numerous different touch points, those are additional points of failure. So when you start looking at your overall supply chain, how can you connect your suppliers with the shippers, with the brokers, all tie that into compliance and make sure that your goods are moving seamlessly throughout. And to support that, having almost a control tower approach or minimizing those touch points is really important. That, again, allows the continuity of how you're managing your business to go through regardless of the number of trade partners. So I think that's really important. So, you know, that is one of the things that I think is going to be continually important, is minimizing those touch points and having continuity.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. So I'll ask you, Ron, first. Do you have any final takeaways on how to mitigate risk through trade compliance?
Sure, especially in today's environment. Jessica touched on it, but having people to go to in associations and being able to consume the information and understand its impacts to your organization is vitally important, especially now. So making, you know, having those contacts, there's associations for just about every industry that's out there. There's associations for importers and exporters, you know, join them, make sure you understand what's happening and get engaged in conversations with other individuals, certainly not antitrust conversations, but understanding what's happening with your industry and try to understand how people are mitigating those types of risk. And so, you know, being able to go back and understand what is it that we're shipping or we're trying to procure from a material perspective, and whether or not those things are compliant, when do I need them? Are there other ways to source from those or source those types of materials from other parts of the world, right? So having a backup plan of being able to understand where am I going to get those in, if you have to get them from another supplier, what is that going to do for your margins, right? So really getting, Jessica really honed on the global trade management system and looking at the data. There's a wealth of information, but how to use it is really the art that you play in a trade compliance role, is understanding all the nuances and where that information is pertinent and important for your organization to be successful.
And Ron, I think you touched on a really good point there, and I just want to add on to something you discussed about other ways to source and the impact margins. You tied that in with the GTM conversation, and understanding that not all organizations have a GTM. This is something that can still be accomplished without a GTM. Certainly a GTM provides you the automation and the power of having all of the data sources in one point. But even if you don't have a GTM, it's really important to make sure that you have this mapped out somewhere within your organization. So if you look at other ways to source or other locations to source, making sure that you understand the cost implications of that, as well as what regulatory requirements there may be. Is it going to shift the timing of your goods getting to market? Are there licenses or registrations that need to be done prior to exporting or upon importing? And if you're going to be shifting your supply chain even more drastically, where perhaps you're moving manufacturing sites, what types of programs exist in those sites that could be cost advantageous to your organization? As Ron was saying, there's lots of programs across the globe, just like there's lots of associations across the globe. And with these programs, there's opportunity to reduce those costs, maybe minimize your duty and tax implications as you look to shift your supply chain. So again, just looking all encompassing and to kind of look even beyond just the GTM. If you don't have a GTM, there's still opportunities for you to gather this information and make these informed decisions.
And my last thought on that is, to Jessica's point, you don't need to have a GTM, but you need to know where you can get that information to be able to make those educated decisions. In the US, we have ACE as a resource to be able to capture your entry information or your export information if an export was filed. In other countries, there's other types of data sources. In Canada, they're implementing CARM. In other places around the world, they have different ways of capturing that information. It might be a little bit more cumbersome, but you have a way in most cases to get that information. Now, aside from the company or the country specific data sources, your brokers or your forwarders can also provide that information as well. And in some cases, it might be a little bit more detail that would provide greater relevance to your organization. So as an example, you don't necessarily get the part number in an ACE report, but you may be able to get your part number as included in your broker's report to be able to specifically know where that part came from what vendor, and those types of things. So it's really important to understand, if you don't have a GTM, there are ways to get that information, but don't just limit it to certain places to get that information, as it might be, your service providers be able to get that information. So.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Ron. And Jessica, for companies, what can companies do if they don't have these skills or knowledge within their organization?
Yes, Natalie, and it can seem like a daunting task, especially if this is something new for an organization, trying to navigate all the different countries that you potentially could be doing business in and how to gather that information. And I can only say that leaning into a good trade compliance partner or someone who can provide you that oversight that is a neutral party to, regardless of which carriers you're using or which brokers you're using, to help you navigate, gather the data, and analyze the data is going to be really important. That's something that the STTAS organization really prides ourselves on, is the ability to be agnostic and be that neutral party in gathering that information. So back to your question, if you don't have the current resources in today, you don't have a GTM and you don't know where to start, you can certainly lean into local expertise, lean into your broker for some compliance expertise, and then more specifically, lean into a consulting division where they could be maybe neutral and look at all of the different aspects of all of your different movements, commodities, and really give a holistic viewpoint of what may be the best decision or some contingencies for your company.
Awesome. Well, Ron and Jessica, thank you so much for taking the time to discuss these pressing supply chain issues with us.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you.
If you'd like to talk more about trade compliance, meet us in the trade compliance booth found in the Hop-In Expo. And join us again on May 17th for our Future of European Trade webinar, where we'll go into a little bit more detail in regards to Eastern European trade, ICS2, and other topics. Thank you so much.